thanks so much for coming, Jim. We really appreciate you joining us in the car. Why don't you tell me a little bit of, kind of who you are and what your background is?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Jim. I'm 31 years old.
We weren't looking for the dating version.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah,
okay.
It's okay.
Yeah. No, I will leave out the year then.
yeah, exactly.
No, so I'm living in the Netherlands, obviously. Big proud fan of Rotterdam. Our office is in Amsterdam. I'm working for ABN AMRO Clearing for about 4 years now.
Okay. Do we want to point out something about Rotterdam versus Amsterdam?
We could.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
All right. I always make the joke in the office that I'm only hiring people from Rotterdam, so that slowly we move our headquarters to Rotterdam. But it takes about I think more 10-20 years later. Then, we have to shop.
Well, you need to maybe start a sponsored educational program in Rotterdam. Specifically tailored to the kind of people.
That would actually be a very good idea. Yeah. Well, actually, that's win one already from this conversation.
Exactly.
Amazing.
Your future startup or kind of an endeavor for ABN.
Exactly. So, but I have a technical background. So I started as a developer. And now I'm a so-called chapter area lead, which might not say.
Yeah, I saw that in your profile. I was like, I wonder what that means.
Yeah, so in short, I'm responsible for our development teams in Europe.
Okay.
So we set up a sort of chapter model at the beginning of this year, which means that the developers report into their chapter leads, and this can be, for example, a Python chapter lead, Java chapter lead.
It's kind of by technology is the chapter. Okay,
exactly.
I was thinking it'd be more like by region. Okay.
Yeah, So we do it by technology now. So that also means that because we have a global presence from an ABN AMRO Clearing perspective, is that even though maybe the Python developers might be in Sydney, Chicago, Amsterdam, that even they also communicate with each other and learn from the best practices amongst each other.
I gotcha. And so which technology stack are you the chapter lead for?
So I'm actually the chapter area lead, so I then coach the chapter leads again. So
gotcha.
Just to make it even more complicated.
Yeah.
But I'm originally my base stack was Python based.
Okay.
Did a little bit of Java as well, a little bit of Angular and Node.
Then you thought better of it and went back to Python?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what I thought.
Yeah.
No offense for Java.
I did Java for 10 years or something.
Okay.
So yeah, I did a lot of Java.
Nice.
And every other language, but we'll get into that.
Yeah, I mean, in general, I still believe that if you develop once, it's sort of a mindset that you learn. Of course, there are nuances in every language. But at least you have a mindset of developing, and that helps a lot.
That is one of the things that I continuously rant about with the tech hiring market is do you really need to find somebody who specifically has 5 years of experience with Python with this particular module, or can you find somebody who knows how to program for a bunch of years and you can just teach them Python in that particular module?
Exactly. Couldn't agree more.
Yeah. It's it really kind of drives me crazy because it's like I know how to do a for loop. I just sometimes need to know the syntax for that particular language.
And let's be honest, if you don't know something, the first thing you do, it used to be Stack Overflow. There's now a new tool on the market, which for let's say popularity purposes, I won't name it here because I think LinkedIn has been flooded with it recently.
Okay.
Might still do it, ChatGPT.
But
I think LinkedIn has been flooded with that.
Well, I actually have a nice little Python tool on the command line called How Do I, which will actually search Stack Overflow and give you a response all from the command line. So you don't even have to break out the browser.
Amazing. So you should share that afterwards for sure. That's amazing.
It's called How Do I. It's very nice. I didn't write it. I just use it. But I promote it all the time.
Nice.
But yeah.
I mean, that's what a developer makes a good developer, right? In the end.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. It was funny. I used to, because I was traveling all the time, and I always have these grand plans of what I was going to work on while I was on the plane, and then realize I can't actually code unless I have the internet as well.
Yeah.
So
very sounds very familiar.
Yeah. Exactly. All right. So we talked a little bit about. Sorry, my directions just decided it was gonna not do them anymore.
It might also be that we end up in Rotterdam.
Could be. I've never been there, so why not?
You should visit.
Yeah. Okay. So you work at a clearing, right? So a bank. And but what is it about kind of the open source world, or what how involved have you been in open source? I mean, you use Python, so you probably have some exposure. But where does that fit into your kind of professional or even non-professional life?
So I think that's actually a good question. So from an open source perspective, I've always found it more important to be able to use the open source version of anything that's available. Not only because it's from a business perspective usually cheaper than the commercial version, but also because the intelligence of the crowd is always so much larger than an individual could ever do.
Yeah, 100%.
Exactly. So I'd like to contribute. I did a bit from a Google perspective in my early years. Also from a Python perspective, I've contributed a bit. And I must admit, in my new role, I've tried to develop bits from time to time. I always told myself I want to keep it in development 1 day a week.
Right. How's that going for you? Yeah, one day every 2 months?
Probably, yeah. I think I'm happy if I do 2-3 hours a week now.
Part of me going to academia was like, oh, maybe I can write code again.
Exactly. I can imagine that.
Yeah, not so much.
No,
not a lot. I think it's, part of it is I think, even though, I'm fairly senior in the tech world, I'm, a 2-year out of college professor, right? Like, I'm still learning how to do all that stuff. And I didn't have a lot of the exposure that I think a lot of, kind of professors do going up through the normal path of like, because I was never a TA anywhere, so it's like, it's all been kind of self-taught, except that, I've done a lot of like conferences and workshops and all that jazz, but I haven't, but teaching a classroom is a different experience.
Completely. Yeah.
But yes, I have not had enough time to do the programming. But I'm getting more efficient, so I'm getting closer. Yeah.
Oh, that's nice. That's cool. Yeah, I think it's very, from a leadership perspective, right? I know you talked about open source before, but I think it's really hard to find people who actually know how to coach a bit and like to explain stuff, and also are quite technically advanced still. And I now know why, because as soon as you sort of reach, let's say, one level higher, you're consumed by other things than development. Right.
Or one of the things I used to say too is like, I had a cube for a long time in the various jobs I had, and eventually I was promoted to like a management level or whatever, and I finally got an office with a door, and I found out why the door is terrible, because it means you have to have closed door conversations, about, someone's underperformance or, things like that. And it's like, I don't want to have these conversations. I want everyone to be awesome.
Exactly.
And so I realized that I didn't actually want the door once I had one.
That's actually quite a nice way of explaining it. Yeah. Oh, I completely agree. As soon as you have the closed door conversations, the conversations usually don't get better.
Right, exactly. So you've been trying to do some coding. It's been going, you've done a bit. And mostly like kind of contributing to things you use, or trying to build stuff on the side, or?
Yeah, both. I think a bit. I contributed a bit in the early days of Kubernetes back then. It was really nice to. Back then, it sounds like I told you I'm 31, but it's still it sounds like 20 years ago. Exactly. Yeah. But the Kubernetes, of course, was really, let's say, a disruption from a technology perspective. And you see that multiple companies, including ours in all honesty, are still making that transition towards containers. And we're doing quite well now, which is nice.
Yeah, that is nice.
But that's one of the, let's say, big disruption categories that were there.
And so, and that's kind of leads to my next question, is that, what do you find kind of characteristically or fundamentally or whatever different about, what they call cloud native development, or, that kind of style versus not, right?
Yeah, it's a good question. Again, a good question actually. But
periodically I have them.
Yeah, no, it's going quite well. I mean, 100% score so far. No, but I think from a cloud native perspective, and I think that's both from a private and public cloud perspective, the cloud native part, is that if you're going to use native services, regardless of the platform that you're using, you actually get most out of it. And I think there's always a discussion, which is a valid one, of course.
Vendor lock. Yeah.
Totally. The exit strategy, vendor lock, which is fine, of course. But I think, I've had those discussions with our architecture teams, and no bad words about our archecture team, because I love you still.
Yeah.
But there's always a certain.
Don't worry, no one will overhear this.
Okay, cool. Okay, that's fine.
Exactly.
I still love them. No, but still, I think if you're looking at a vendor lock-in from only when you're doing cloud native stuff, I think you're lying to yourself, because vendor lock-in is not something that only exists when you do cloud native. It might be a bit more apparent because the focus is there.
Right.
But if you have a complete landscape of, let's say, Linux servers, VMs that are hosted by maybe even an external contracting party, an external vendor, then trying to move to a new technology, I mean, good luck with that. That's also going to be a 10-year program to do that.
Right,
so,
right.
Lock-in is always there.
Right. Yeah. One of the things you kind of are putting it nicely, like it's more obvious. Like when I was in some of the consulting I was doing, we were first trying to get people to move to the cloud, and they would talk about like how concerned they were about the security of the access into their environments, and and so then I would essentially proceed into a discussion of how many nightly batches do you run with how many different partners that all have custom firewall punches. What you might actually find is that when you move to the cloud, well, everything will break, but you will actually find out how many holes you actually had. And I think that what's nice about those native services is you're more clearly making a choice to choose that vendor or whatever than you did sometimes in the past, where you were just kind of firing off to this API over here and nobody really knew what it was. And so I think it's a little simpler to have like you said, visibility into, well, where is our vendor lock?
Exactly. And I think the one sort of common phrase in development has always been that you should focus on where you can deliver value. And for a long time, we've always thought that we had to host our own infrastructure because, well, that's part of what you do when you do IT.
Right.
And I'm happy that that sort of the view is slowly going away. Because in the end, we want to actually run our code because that's what delivers value in the end, much more than running our own servers, stacks, VMs, so that sort of stuff.
Right. You're not a cloud hosting provider.
Exactly. That abstraction layer goes up and up and up, even a bit further by time. So I'm also trying in our organization, of course, right, there's always a sort of stigma on a bank because a bank is old, and I won't say that we don't have legacy systems in our case. But I do see that we are moving towards a more native approach, both from a public perspective and private perspective.
And you find that most of the kind of engineers or architects or whatever, like, are they kind of immediately getting it, or is there a lot of kind of training, for lack of a better term, but basically teaching of how to understand that better? Yeah,
I think that there's some developers. Of course, there's always a group that's so sort of enthusiastic that they found it out by themselves, and they've already found it out way before the company, which is always cool. But I think there's a big misconception that sort of using the cloud native services is just replatforming, for example. But there's a completely different mindset involved in developing cloud native. It requires different skill sets. So we do try to train quite frequently as well.
Well, I think it's particularly difficult because you can develop systems in the cloud that are very traditional. It's just, and it's super easy to fall into that trap. And you really aren't taking advantage of what it means to have that, kind of distributed infrastructure that is really where all the benefit is.
Exactly. And I think the mistake that we tend to make sometimes, of course, you probably know the 7 R's of AWS as well. Let's say replatform, refactor, that sort of stuff. And what we sometimes make as a mistake is that we just get our current application, we throw it all in the same container, and then we host it containerized, and then we say, now we're actually cloud native.
Although I will say, my guidance for a long time to people was, if you were trying to bring something, to a container or whatever, is actually to do that to start, right? And then kind of start to pair off the services, but don't let the you have to re-architect the whole thing gate you from even taking the first step, which can be, a little bit scary because all the documentation tells you, well, you can't run more than one application per container and all this other stuff. And it's like, you're better off kind of starting to think container, even if you're not quite doing it right, as quickly as possible than you are to wait. It was actually, in a lot of ways, that's why the big push behind like service-oriented architecture kind of didn't take off very well. So it was all top down. It was all boil the entire ocean, and then you get some benefit. Whereas the microservices model is, don't just start this tiny little bit, and keep building and building and building. Even though they're, as I said, actually in another interview, they're just still services. It's just
true.
But
it makes a difference. I think you touched upon the microservices. I think there's always, as it is with everything, right? There's a balance between where your productivity is. If you're talking about microservices, then if you peel off very specific services from an existing application, that's also a great way to start building a containerized application, because it also makes it a lot smaller and easier to start with, right? That's the
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, but you don't have to kind of do it all at once. You can do piece by piece.
Exactly.
So you, I think, have been working primarily with OpenShift, or thinking about OpenShift, or you're mostly, kind of native Kubernetes?
Yeah, we're using OpenShift now for, I think, 6 or 7 years.
Oh, wow. Okay, so not recent.
But it's now the interesting part comes. Because we've been using it for 6 or 7 years. That's when we first started sort of the talks about going towards OpenShift, because hosting our own Kubernetes platform, again, is not something that's in our core business. So why should we do it ourselves then? It's better to let someone manage the platform or manage the cluster that have proven experience with it. But still, nowadays, and that's, I think, our biggest challenge, we have, let's say, about 10 to 15% of our applications have moved. And we do see, let's say, the exponential growth now. The platform consumability is going up.
Yeah.
But it's been a tough journey to get to move over, right? Because also, it's not only from a tech perspective. If you also look at the product, or never is in the end. We have to make money in the end, and the people that have the decision power, of course, don't see direct value in making that shift, right? If you're rebuilding, replatforming.
Yeah, there's no new features. Yeah.
Exactly.
Right. I mean, and it's always so tough, right, to write a cost saving story, because most of the time it's like, I'd rather operate a new feature story, or sell, particularly for those kinds of people. So I think most of my work has always been around trying to make sure that, in consulting or whatever, it's like, oh yeah, you're going to get this thing and this thing and this thing. Oh, and by the way, we're also going to replatform.
And that's the perfect way of doing it. It's really true. I think, we are working for a bank, obviously, so what always works great, and it's not even a lie, to be honest, it's actually very true as well. Your risk appetite also is much better than it was before if you actually do make that step. Right, yeah. And that's because, banks are quite risk averse, which is a good thing. Right, that helps. Yeah, except when they're not, and that's usually a bad thing. That's, exactly. Yeah. We saw some examples recently. Exactly. We, like I said, I did a lot of consulting in financial services, and just between, and it was interesting, even within the same bank, different parts of it being way more or less risk averse. Which is also really interesting. Go kind of where the customers are, right? But I think that's actually an interesting point, because being sort of risk averse and innovation usually doesn't go together that well. Yeah. So I think even, I'm not generally a fan of doing forced proof of concepts and forcing people into a room to do something new because we have to do it. Right. But in these kinds of concepts and these kinds of environments, it does sometimes work to really get people in a room and do something completely isolated from what we do on a day-to-day basis, just to get them in touch with the new technology. Because you can get lost in day-to-day business if you don't do that from time to time. Right. Yeah, I mean, it's funny, like, you have the lunch and learns kind of, and a lot of the time, they don't seem to be kind of very effective, at least in my experience, or things like that, where it's kind of like, it's happening so regularly that, people aren't really kind of like considering it as like part of their job to go to those kinds of things. So I really like some of the, a lot of organizations are starting to do, I can't think what it's typically called, but basically like a Hacktoberfest kind of model, or whatever, where they take maybe a week a quarter or a week every, year, or who knows, and actually have all of their employees, all the developer employees, or actually we've seen docs and stuff like that too, actually go and contribute to some open source projects that are like completely unrelated to the organization, so that you can kind of like get that spark back again, get some exposure to different ways of doing things. Because, I think a lot of the time when if you're working just with the same kind of people and the same development models and stuff like that, you just don't see new ways to do it. Exactly. It's easy to stay in that box and don't get out of it. Right. It's really, and sometimes I don't think you necessarily even know you're in the box, right? It's like, there's walls out there, until you see somebody who's doing something completely different. And it really does change your mind, and I think, and a big part of that kind of cloud native adoption or whatever is like, you
it's fundamentally architecturally different. If you're not seeing that part of it, you often are not going to be able to take advantage of it.
Exactly. And that makes it difficult, right? Because usually if you take the decision makers in the company, it's even harder for them to explain why it is fundamentally different. And if the development teams don't get that new concept either, for them, they won't explain it to the decision makers either. So it makes it really hard to make that movement going.
Right. So what have you found, so you said recently you've really been seeing adoption curve kind of go up. What do you think has been that driver? Are you doing something different? Is it snowball effect? Is it, what kind of hints do you have for people listening to the show for them to be able to get other people to adopt things?
So I think it's two main drivers. I think one of them is the service-oriented part from a platform perspective. I think one of the pitfalls that we had in the past is that the platform teams actually making sure that the developers have the ability to develop on OpenShift, for example, or AWS whatsoever, that they actually are developing the platform for our developers to work on. And because they're technicians themselves as well, they also like to make the platform as perfect for themselves to work with, but sometimes forget the customer on the other end. And that's one thing that's really going well recently, also because of the communication between both parties. And I think the second part is related, but it has to do with the consumability of the platform. So what you see happening, there's of course always, when you move to a new platform, and in this case also a new way of thinking, a huge learning curve for everyone. And to make it even more complex, I think in most corporates you have also various different departments that all want to have a say in security, compliance, governance. And if you have every single team going through that same process, then both security, governance and compliance, and architecture, by the way, will get tired of telling the same story all over again. And development teams all take about, let's say a year to actually make that shift. So what we did is, when I implemented...
In my experience also, developer teams are not all that patient. So,
I rest my case. That's I can completely relate from my previous experience. So
not at your current company, though, of course.
No, obviously not.
Perfect in every way.
It's, love you, ABN. So we're looking for people still, by the way. That's
hint.
Self-promotion. Anyway, so what we did, we actually put a team between our platform and product teams, which we call development services, which is sort of, what's in the name. But what they actually do is create consumable constructs that our developers can just pull from any repo. So we have, of course, our own internal Git repos. But there are consumable Docker files, Jenkins files, OpenShift template YAMLs, all that sort of stuff. But already with the requirements from the platform team, the security team, governance, compliance, and architecture baked in. So that means they're pre-approved, consumable, and it works in our environment, which means that they don't have to start all the way from scratch. And that's something you see that the adoption is really going well so far.
I'm wholeheartedly in agreement. One of the things that I actually think is interesting that I've seen a few organizations do is also do rotation. So you actually have some of the normal developer teams, one of their members joins the developer enablement team for a few months, or a year or whatever, and then kind of rotating back through. It's kind of similar to the model of if you're doing a software product and you actually rotate your kind of core engineers through maintenance and making sure, or even customer support.
That also helps.
Because it really gives you kind of like a real touch point. And it's one of the things I work on with our students is like trying to get them to understand that, this data or this application or whatever, there's like people on the other side, and you need to be aware that every row in that data set or whatever is a human. And I think forcing a developer back to those touch points really makes a difference in how they focus their work. So I thought that was a cool idea.
No, for sure. And I think if you, me as a developer, I will talk from my own perspective. I think getting that touch back with your actually end customer, be it someone internal or some team internal or external, also gives you a better vibe of a feeling of value, right? You want to be, you want your work to matter, and if you don't know how it matters, then it's really hard to make that value.
Yeah, no, totally. And and I don't know, you also get the sometimes, not all the time, but you get a little bit of the pat on the back, like, hey, sure. Somebody actually likes the stuff we build.
I think that's extremely important to have. Yeah, that recognition of your work is very important.
Yeah. Although I spent a lot of my career as a fixer, and so most of the time, all I was there was to get yelled at. But then I fixed it. So
and then you make people happy anyway.
Right, and then I disappear and made sure the team takes the credit so that they can continue.
Exactly. But it's very noble.
Yeah. Well, there's something. But it's certainly a lot of fun. Yeah, Volkswagen Bug.
Oh wow, that's very nice. Yeah.
Old school, like that's like a 73, 72.
It looks like a nice color as well.
Yeah, I had one that was like dark blue, but it was a 75, so it was like a Super Beetle.
Yeah.
But then chrome everywhere on it. It was gorgeous. First time I turned it on though, the entire steering column lit on fire. So yeah, the first thing I had to do was rewire a lot of it.
Nice.
Didn't have working windshield wipers for a while, and then I went through a sprinkler and realized that maybe I needed working windshield wipers. But I had a lot of fun fixing that car.
I can imagine. I mean, it's also part of the fun of having one, right? I can imagine.
Yeah, and it's a very straightforward engine, so you can, basically anybody can do it.
I couldn't.
Well, there was a great book, and my father actually had a bit of a mechanical bent, and so he would guide me when I got really stuck. But for the most part, there was the Zen. No, there was the Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, but there was like a similar book for Volkswagen Bugs.
Yeah.
It basically told you how the entire car worked. So you just break it out and start tinkering with stuff. I mean, the worst you could do was like make it not run. Yeah. So it wasn't running anyway.
That doesn't make it any worse.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, it was pretty neat. These days, with the electrics and all that jazz, no one's gonna have any idea how cars work.
No.
I don't think we know how it works anymore. Like I didn't know this, that so even if you have a gas powered engine, a lot of the time the whatever you call it, like the soundproofing is so good that you actually can't hear the engine, and so the engine noise you hear inside the cab is actually manufactured.
You're kidding?
Yeah,
really?
Or it'll have like a pipe basically, just so you can hear it.
Wow.
Yeah, I was like, whoa.
I didn't know it from electrical cars, right? That they have to make outside noise at least to be known.
I, as a regular pedestrian, where they don't make a lot of outside noise, I'm often terrified to cross the street.
Well, I also drive electric. It's amazing to creep up on people and just shout. No, I don't do it in real life. It's really nice.
It's one of those things that if you were an evil person, you would like to do. It's like it's like tauntingly there, but you can't actually do it.
No.
Yeah. No, I totally understand. Yeah. Well, I think this has been great. Saint, thank you so much for joining us in the cool car, and hopefully you had a nice tour of Amsterdam. I mean, it's no Rotterdam, but
I was gonna say. No, thank you so much for having me, and it's next time we should do it in Rotterdam, but I will invite you over then to do it there. Right.
Yeah, well, you just have to find us a car.
Yeah, no, don't worry. Yeah. We can do it in my Volkswagen e-Golf. No worries.
Right. I can only interview at maximum one half of a person.
Yeah, that's fine. I'm not that tall anyway. So that's,
yeah.